Thank you for taking time out of your day to join us in this important conversation presented by the UNLV College of Education Scholarship and Practice webinar on Making the Cut, helping student athletes make successful transitions from high school to college. I'm Dr. Lisa Kelleher, a visiting assistant professor here in the College of Education. I teach both graduate and undergraduate courses and have been working in athletics for over 40 years. 40 years, wow. Till I actually put that on paper, I didn't really realize it was that long. But anyhow, until I transitioned into the faculty. Our esteemed panel includes my co-lead, Dr. Nancy Lowe, UNLV professor in higher education and director of our Intercollegiate Athletic Professional Sports Management. And it's our founding year, so we have a new cohort this year, and we're all excited about that, and we're bringing in several next year. And our panelists, Mallory Poole, UNLV Associate Athletic Director of Wellness and Leadership and the Senior Women Administrator, Rebecca Pugh, UNLV Associate Athletics Director of SAS, otherwise known to us as Student Athlete Academic Services, and Dr. Chad Dorr, Director of Counseling and Sports Psychology for UNLV Athletics, our newest member to the athletic department, just starting here in April. So welcome, Dr. Dorr. Today's topics will include, but are not limited to, outlining to you how teams can better understand and foster diversity, gender equity, and inclusion, explaining how a student athlete can take a leadership role and embrace a wellness model for overall student athlete success, discussing the NCAA requirements for a student athlete to matriculate at a university, and providing tools for you to help a student athlete understand how to balance performance, academics, and mental health. I'd like to go ahead and get started with an expert in the area of organizational leadership and gender equity. Dr. Lowe has extensive experience in intercollegiate athletics, including competing as a scholarship athlete and having worked as a collegiate coach in Texas and California. She was also an associate athletic director in Colorado and a director of an NCAA championship. Dr. Lowe served as a sports management faculty member at the University of New Mexico, Iowa State, and Kent State, my home state. She is currently a professor in the College of Education, where she leads the master's degree program in our new Intercollegiate Athletic and Professional Sports Management master's degree. Dr. Lowe will now lead the discussion in what we know as DEI, or Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, Leadership and Wellness, and she will also give her perspective and share her experiences and advice in these areas as well. Dr. Lowe?
Thank you, Lisa. Welcome, everyone. So very happy to have you join us today. You've got a really incredible panel here with the expertise from everyone who's here, including Lisa's 40 years of experience, my 30 some odd years of experience, and then all together, I think we're representing a great deal of experience here. So very nice to have you join us. I'm going to start today with a topic that's very dear to my heart. It's something I've been studying for ever because I've lived it, and that's Title IX. Happens to be the 50th anniversary of Title IX. And when we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, this is probably one of the most important laws that we could really reflect upon. So yesterday was actually the 50th day out, 50 days out from the official anniversary of Title IX. So this June, you will see a lot happening to celebrate this federal law that basically prevents discrimination on the basis of sex within any educational entity. So what I want to share with you first is a little context. 50 years ago, few girls could compete in high school or even college sport. Many colleges had quotas where they would only allow as many as, say, 5 women into a class of, say, 50 men, or any discipline. Pick a discipline, law, medicine, doesn't really matter. This is an incredibly big difference from where we are today. Today, we tend to see a higher number of women graduating each year at our universities and colleges, not substantially, but sometimes 60-40. Not that that was the goal or even what anyone would have expected in 1972, but to think about how far we've come is really, truly just incredible. When I tell you 5 women out of a class of 50, that really is telling you that the representation of women in all of higher education, all colleges and universities, was somewhere around 5% back then. And a lot of things were done to prevent women from being able to access higher education. For example, women were required to live in residence housing or dormitories. You might say, well, why is that such a bad thing? Well, it was a bad thing because it was an extra burden financially. If men weren't required to live in dormitories or res halls, why were women, right? If you could stay at home and get your education, that would potentially lighten your financial burden. So there were a number of things that were in place that really, really prevented women from being able to access higher education. That has since changed, fortunately, because of the passage of Title IX in 1972. Today, we have over 3 million girls every year that participate in high school athletics. It's a phenomenal number. We have closer to 300,000 women who participate in college athletics every year. Again, a phenomenal number. And in that, we've seen just incredible growth in the acceptance of women in sports. So I'll point to softball right now because it's a sport that's happening and you can actually catch it on ESPN. The Women's College World Series sells out every single year. It also has viewership numbers that are eclipsing those of the baseball World Series, right? So we've really turned the tide with regard to how women in sport are accepted. Back in 72, 82, even 92, if you were a female athlete, you were looked at as someone who was, contrary to gender roles. And it wasn't cool to be an athlete. If anything, you were stereotyped and stigmatized by being a college athlete. Fortunately, that has changed, but we also know that there's still some of those stereotypes that have lived on. For example, when we think about the leadership of women's sport, we have a very low representation of women at the highest levels of sport leadership. It's awesome that we have 2 associate athletic directors here today to talk to you from our athletic department. And of course, Lisa, having reached the senior leadership level for many, many years and providing guidance, but they really are still more of an anomaly than a common representation. So, increasing women in sport is something that I've been working on for quite some time. To give you an example, at the head coaching ranks, we have about 42% of the head coaches of women's sport are women. You might say, well, that's not so bad, but in reality, in 1972, 90% of the head coaches of women's sport were women. Sounds pretty contrarian, like how could that possibly be the case? The reality is guys didn't want to coach women's sport in the 1970s or 80s for that matter, because there was no money, there was no status, right? If anything, what would be the point of coaching women? Today, clearly, there's a lot of opportunity to coach women that involves status and money. It's a good job. And so we are at a point now where it's very, very difficult for women to compete for jobs in women's sport. And then in the ranks of coaching men, of course, we're seeing our anomalies here and there, which is wonderful, but it's about 1 or 2% of women who ever make it into coaching men's sport. And I tell you this because these are role models, right? There's a whole lot of women, college athletes, who've never experienced a head female coach. Oftentimes, their first head coach that's a woman is in college. And that, might not seem like any big deal to you, but it is a big deal. We adhere to the see her, be her philosophy, which is when girls see women doing things that they think they might want to do, it gives them a sense of agency, a sense of I can do this because I see someone else has also already forged that path. And that's not to say that there aren't those who want to be the first, right? But there can only be one first. At some point, we've got to have those who are coming after them, and we've got to fill that pipeline. The flip side of that is if 42% of the coaches of women's sport are women, that means that 60 or 58% are men, and those men are getting almost 100% of the jobs to coach men's sport, right? So they get basically 150% of the chances to coach, whereas women don't get that same number. A good resource to go to if you want to learn more about this is the Tucker Center for Research on Girls and Women in Sport, where they actually issue an annual report card on universities and colleges where you can see what their representation of head coaches of women's sport actually is. There have been historically only 2 universities that actually got an A on this report card. UNLV was not one of them. Although I will tell you, UNLV did climb to a B very, very recently, and we have women in our head coaching roles of women's sport in most of our sports. It's quite impressive. But that was intentional, right? When it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion, one of the most important things is intentionality. It is not going to happen by happenstance. That's just all there is to it. I am convinced 100%, and even more so with the recent Supreme Court ruling that came out this week. It's not official, it's just a document release, but nonetheless, any law in this land is at risk of being challenged and of being changed. So while people often say, well, Title IX's done its job, don't you think? And there's not really all that much of a need for it anymore. I always say, I'm sorry, but I don't agree. And I'm not sorry. I wholeheartedly do not agree. I lived through 2001 when the Bush administration and the National Wrestling Coaches Association tried to basically undermine Title IX and take it out of effect. So it is entirely possible that this law could go away if we're not vigilant about making sure that there's a focus on gender equity, on non-discrimination of people on the basis of sex, which is what Title IX protects. Another really good resource that I want to recommend is the Equity in Athletics Disclosure Act. This is actually, it's a website, the EADA website. In this website, universities and colleges have to report every year the amount of money that they spend on women's sport and men's sport. This is a place where you can go and actually, if you're coaching an athlete or you're helping an athlete with recruiting, you can look and compare across different universities to see just what is their commitment to women's sport financially. And that's a really good tool. That's actually what that tool has been developed for, is so that people can, in fact, make those comparisons, be educated, and say, I think this is a good place to send this athlete, or maybe this isn't the right place for this athlete. So a couple of good resources there to share with you, a couple of good things to think about with regard to Title IX. I also wanted to talk briefly about college sport as a path to college degrees. I think one of the things that is such an important point for people to hear is that we've lost sight of what matters when it comes to sport at the youth level and very often at the high school level. The number one reason why kids quit sport is because they stop having fun. It's that simple. They stop having fun. And I say that because coaches have to remember fun is at the heart of what sport is all about. We say we play sport, and that's intentional. The word play is at the heart of what sport is. I say this because I was a coach that forgot it was supposed to be fun. I got very intense in college as an athlete. I was on a national championship team. It was all about being All-American. And then I went up back to the high school level to coach, and I was too intense. I was focused on all the wrong things. Kids have to have fun. When they're having fun, they'll keep playing. As soon as the pressure from coaches, the pressure from parents, the pressure to get a scholarship, on and on and on, weighs too heavy on them, they're going to quit. The same thing that's really important in that space is little things that you might not think about for female athletes. We know we lose female athletes in junior high in particular. A lot of times we never even get them to the high school ranks. A lot of that has to do with socialization sorts of things about gender role, about what's appropriate for a girl. Of course, they start having all kinds of changes with their body. One thing that's been overlooked is the fact that sometimes they're just incredibly uncomfortable in the uniforms that they're required to wear. If you look at the volleyball uniform that girls have to wear, a lot of them will simply opt out of the sport because they don't want to wear those bun huggers and be in front of people competing and not knowing what's going on with their body. We can do better for our female athletes. We can create the kinds of uniforms, the kind of spaces, the kinds of opportunities that really encourage them to continue to participate in their sport, to enjoy it, to have fun, and to want to go all the way to the next level, to the college level. When we think about accessing scholarships and getting to college, there is no question that college athletics has done a tremendous job of opening the opportunity to so many students from marginalized communities. That's across all kinds of different statuses, right? Whether it's race, whether it's socioeconomic status, whatever it might be, a number of these young people would never have had the opportunity to access higher education. That's incredibly important, but it's also important that we understand when we're helping them choose a university or a college, we need to look at more than just who's recruiting them or, who wants to give them the best deal. Predominantly white institutions are oftentimes a really difficult fit for a kid that is coming from a minority or a marginalized community background. So a young man or woman who's coming from a predominantly African American background going to a predominantly white institution could present challenges beyond those that are always there for any young person coming to college. The transition from high school to college isn't simple, easy, and quick, right? There's a whole adjustment that happens in that. And a lot of times, these young people feel very uncomfortable. That whole idea of imposter syndrome, right? Like, do I belong here? So we got to help them with that. We got to coach them as they're getting ready to go to college about the fact that, almost everybody feels some of that. And the beautiful thing about college is that it tends to be a lot of different people coming together to explore a whole host of new ideas, a whole host of new degrees, to learn about themselves. And that's another important piece here. I put down athletic identity as something to talk about, and I'm not going to go into detail about it, but we got to help these kids explore who they are beyond their identity as an athlete. Well, a lot of times what happens is when young people get so identified with their sport that it becomes the vast majority of their identity, when they get injured, when they're no longer able to participate in the sport, say it's just that time in their life, whether it's the end of college or, they get cut from a team, they can be really, really lost. They can be really searching for who they are because they've always been so identified with their identity as an athlete. So it's our job to help them explore other sides of who they are, what they're about, what they're interested in. Being an athlete is fantastic. It's wonderful. It's such a good thing, especially from a health standpoint. Hopefully they'll continue to do it throughout their life, participating in sport, remaining healthy and fit. But it is our job as the adults that they look to try to help them understand that they're more than just an athlete. And there's more for them out there at a university and a college when they get that opportunity. So with that, I'm going to transition now to in my notes. All right, so I'm going to transition now to Mallory Poole. I think this is the perfect segue. Our Associate Athletic Director of Wellness and Leadership and the Senior Woman Administrator at UNLV. Mallory is responsible for overseeing all development areas that impact the student athlete experience. She spearheads the Go Pro Jobs initiative, which is related to what I was just talking about. She's also the sport administrator for softball and the volleyball programs at UNLV. And Mallory's now going to discuss how student athletes can take on leadership roles during their time as student athletes. She'll explain how student athletes might embrace a wellness model of health in order to stay fit for their transition to college. And she'll also give her perspective and share her experience and advice as a former Long Island University lacrosse player, I believe, Mallory, right? So Mallory Poole.
Yeah, I appreciate the introduction and perfect segue, Dr. Lowe. As she shared, I had an opportunity to be a student athlete at the Division II level and competed at the national level for a portion of my career before transitioning into being an athletic coach at the Division III, II, and I level. So hopefully my perspective will offer some assistance for all those that are guiding young people through that process. And I think you hit on a few things, but that adjustment, Dr. Lowe, certainly from the high school level to the college level is absolutely, I think, kind of a defining moment for young people. And so, I think if I had to offer some perspective as it relates to how a coach or parent might help prepare that young person for acclimating through that process, I would really encourage promoting this narrative that sports, and especially the struggle, doesn't define them, but rather helps develop them into being successful through life. And I think, if I had to speak from my own personal experience, if somebody were to ask me about myself, I'd probably pretty quickly say I'm a lacrosse player and identify with that aspect of what it was that I was doing at that time. And I would say right now, when I work with our cohort of student athletes here at UNLV, and I say, tell me about yourself, pretty quickly sport finds its way into the top of the things that they would share. And so I often follow up with that soft reminder to a point you just made, Dr. Lowe, which is, your sport is what you do and it's not who you are. And how can we continue to help remind them that they have skills that they use in the sports space, but those skills translate into, other areas of their lives. And so really our responsibility as educators is to help them explore what those other interests are so they can take those skills that they're developing in the sports space and then activate them in these other areas. And so, pretty recently I was reading through a colleague of mine who I don't know personally, but is the director of player development at CBU. And he commented, and I want to quote him and give him credit for this, but he said, some will place a lot of worth and value on the outcome of a game, while others see sport as part of the process and becoming who they're meant to be. Differentiating between solely identifying as an athlete and being athletic can help our young people handle results better. And I loved how he framed that, because I really think that that's incredibly important. And, when I think of preparing for being a collegiate student athlete, I really think a lot about just the character strengths that we develop through the opportunity to compete and the things that we learn about ourselves. And so I would encourage all those that are tuning in today to really help our young people draw the correlation between what they're experiencing now and really how it helps prepare them for the future, and more about the development, the process, and the things that we learn. It's so much more important than the 3-pointer or the home run or the touchdown scored, and really just the skills that we develop. So, one of the things that I feel really fortunate about in my role now is helping facilitate those opportunities outside of that structured space so that exploration can take place. And so I would like to just highlight a couple of areas, if I could. Actually behind me and over my shoulders is the Make Your Mark wall, which I'll explain here in a second, because I think it kind of ties into these pieces. But, I think a lot of times when I'm having these conversations with our young people, it can be difficult for them to see who it is that they are outside of this identity, this athletic identity. And so when we start talking about future, it can feel a little paralyzing, maybe for lack of a better phrase. And so sometimes how we ask questions can offer them some confidence. So a lot of times, we sit down and we talk about identity and career space, try to sort of flip the script a little bit on them. And instead of asking them, what do you want to do with your degree? It's more about, how do you want to make your mark on the world? What problems do you want to solve? And tapping into those things that they're passionate about, and the aspects of their identities that they can maybe connect to as it relates to interests and, various passions, and then kind of working our way backwards from there into what are careers that would allow you to exercise those purposes and those passions that you have outside of the game. And so, really focusing on the person versus the athlete and the student in some respect. And I'm of the belief that if you focus on the person first, the performance piece follows, right? And so again, it's kind of moving away from the results on the field and helping our young people understand that their value far exceeds that identity. And so here would be some takeaways that I would certainly offer the group. As it relates to exploring interests, get involved, right? Beyond just the mandatory athletic and academic space. I had an opportunity as a student athlete to get a job in the weight room at the rec center. And I thought that was great for me. It was super flexible. I probably put in about 10 hours a week. But what it did do is it offered me an opportunity to be associated with a different community of people. And I thought that was really healthy for my development as a young adult. I had to interview for the job. So I kind of put myself through a process of really experiencing what it meant to work outside of the dedication to being a student athlete. And I can tell you, speaking from experience, that sometimes our student athletes are challenged by their time demands. And that's reasonable because they do put in quite a bit of work. But it's finding, other pockets of time, whether it's a summer job or a winter internship, encouraging that involvement on campus. I also attended yoga sessions on campus, and that was really helpful for me when I transitioned away from training because I had other interests in exercise that were outside of what was required as a lacrosse athlete. And I thought that was really helpful during my transition. And then really getting in the community as well. A lot of our student athletes are involved in different volunteer opportunities. But again, it's another touch point for them to really explore other interests and maybe meeting peers or other campus or community members that might help shape what later becomes this support system. And that really draws me to kind of point number 2, which is investing in creating relationships and mentors, both with your coaching staff, but I think outside of it as well. And as we move through life, it helps to have this sphere of folks around you, whether it's parents or coaches or friends or other mentors that can help guide you. And so spending time investing in those relationships can be incredibly valuable as you move through the world. I still actually work out with my strength coach from college. We FaceTime a couple of days a week. And I think it just speaks to the strength of that relationship and the impact that had on my life, that we still continue to, he still supports me in that way. And then I think really the last point that I would love to talk a little bit about, because we talk quite a bit about it, is in sport, if we're going into competition, we draw a lot of our confidence from practice, right? So like if I have a basketball player that I'm talking to, it's unlikely that the first time they shoot a free throw is during the game, right? Like they've put in the reps at practice. They've probably put in some extra hours, maybe outside of practice. But the point being is that before our student athletes were winning at something, they were beginning. They had to start somewhere. And so when we talk about exploration and looking at our other, exploring our many identities, starting and putting ourselves in a position to kind of work through a little bit of that discomfort, right? Because that first layup probably looked a little funny, but then you rep it a few times and you get a little bit better. And then all of a sudden you're not even thinking about it, right? Like the right hand goes up with the right knee and that becomes routine. And I find that student athletes understand that practice is really what allows them to have confidence as they move into competition. And we try to draw those parallels as it relates to going into career exploration or going into these other areas of, campus involvement or community involvement, because doing it will help remove that discomfort the first time. And then as we do more and more and more, we're able to kind of compound that interest and really draw confidence from that. So I think that, if you're working with a young person as they go through the recruiting process, the more we can support this idea of focusing on the person and not necessarily the outcomes of what we do, I believe can be incredibly valuable. So I appreciate the opportunity to share some of those perspectives.
Awesome. Thank you, Mallory. I think looking at our time frame, Lisa, I'm going to go ahead and toss it to you and let you take it from here.
That sounds good. Thank you, Dr. Lowe. There are many steps an intercollegiate athletics student athlete must take from an academic perspective before transitioning into college. Here to tell us more is Rebecca Pugh, UNLV Associate Athletic Director of SAS, who oversees the day-to-day operations of a student athlete academic services. She's responsible for monitoring and maintaining institutional compliance with the NCAA, the Mountain West Conference, and the university rules and regulations to promote the academic eligibility, success, and retention of all the student athletes participating in intercollegiate athletic programs. She will now detail all that is required to meet the, maybe not all, but most of that's required to meet the NCAA standards for incoming student athletes. She will also give her perspective and share her experience and advice as a former recruited UNLV softball player. So Becky, let me start off with just a scenario. How does one prepare a student athlete to play for an athletic competitive program where they might likely face some significant academic challenges because maybe their grades are mid-level Cs? And then you can go from there.
Thank you, Lisa. Great question. I believe what you all will see in a lot of my responses is that early education, proactivity, and time management will be a central theme. And this is all in towards preparedness and transition into college. So directly into that question, I would suggest really hammering home the concept of managing their day. It's really going to help prepare them. Have them get used to setting aside time to study, see their teachers and professors using them as resources already, seeking tutoring. The schedule of an intercollegiate student athlete can be so much sometimes that it can be tempting to even take a nap right after practice. So building those good habits early of planning out schoolwork can really go miles once they start to transition into a collegiate setting. And then also encouraging them and reminding them to ask questions and seek help. This is not a weakness, it is a strength. In fact, in all of my orientations, especially with my incoming student athletes, I have a whole slide dedicated to quotes about how asking for help is a strength and that you need to use your resources. That's how you will be successful, especially if you're feeling a little less confident in an area. There's nothing wrong with asking for help. The most successful students are the ones that communicate and seek help, actually, is what we have found. This advice is important even for your academically strong students in high school, almost as important as your high at-risk students. It's really important because they are used to being high-achieving students, and they need to start to grasp that college is harder than high school, and that you may not get the straight A's that you're used to getting in high school without putting in that extra work. It can be incredibly mentally taxing for students to adjust no matter what level they came in. So having that support, that early education, building that preparedness will help any student on the spectrum to be ready. So going into that, I'd also like to share my perspective on specific topics on NCAA initial eligibility and my experience as a recruited student athlete. So my number one piece of advice, if you haven't done this already, is that simply Google NCAA initial eligibility and you'll have the direct link to their toolkit. It's going to give you the full breakdown of the basic requirements to hit to become a qualifier and play, depending on what level your students are looking at. Division 1, 2, or 3, there are resources for all of those areas. But that is like a go-to piece of information just to have handy, to memorize, and to start working on as early as possible, because the better you set yourself up from the beginning, the students won't have as much pressure on them as they get into their junior and senior year if they're proactively working towards these measures. So the basic breakdown is that the students have to meet 16 core courses within the 8 semesters, 4 years of English, 3 years of math, 2 years of natural or physical science, 1 year of English, math, or natural or physical science, and then 2 years social science, and then 4 years of extra core courses. They need a minimum GPA requirement in their core courses, which is usually 2.3 or higher. And then there's also this academic redshirt requirements, which is if you're below that GPA, you can technically come in as an academic redshirt, but you wouldn't be able to play in your first year. It gives you a chance to kind of get academically prepared in college that first year. Going into that, so like, since there's 3 years of math required, I think one piece of strong information that a lot of our students don't necessarily set up or prepare for is that the 3 years of math is required, but we try to let the incoming recruits know, prepare yourself to take math in your first year, because in most colleges, you're going to be taking math again your freshman year. Sometimes it hurts you to leave a little gap. So if you're not taking math your senior year in high school, it's going to be a little bit tough to get back on that math bandwagon there. So to just align when you're taking your courses is really helpful as well. Going into kind of test taking, I know that's a hot topic. Right now, it's technically not required. It could be expected to go back. But what we are recommending to all prospects is that if you are a student and have the resources and capability to take a standardized test, do it. It can help with college course placement, because you're going to be taking that math, you're going to be taking English, and here at UNLV, if you haven't taken the standardized test, you have to take a placement exam or assessment to get placed into those courses anyway. So if you get those standardized tests, it can just automatically set you up. And then potentially academic aid can be affected. They can get more aid based off of their standardized test scores. So it's really important to do that. Also, a lot of STEM majors require it anyway. So it's a benefit to have that if they're capable of going in and doing that. Lastly, I would encourage students to be flexible in their approach as they're starting to explore college and where they're looking. We never ask them what they want to major in, rather what they want to do in life. There are so many different paths that you can take to keep that open mind. So students don't get discouraged by like maybe seeing one of their top colleges that they want to go to doesn't have this major. Like if they wanted to be going to med school, you don't need a biology major. There's just prerequisites that you have to hit and some admissions requirements you have to hit, and you don't have to go into hotel to be a hospitality major. You can go into business, or there's just lots of different paths. So to keep the student's mind open and not to worry and close it into just a little shell of opportunity, there are lots of different ways to go about what you want to do. So yeah, when they focus on that, they enjoy it, and they invite the process, it will get them to where they need to go.
Well, thank you, Becky. Becky knows that normally we have this NCAA book, but now everything's online to save trees. But the book is literally this thick. So she gave you a snippet of just for the entering students that transition from high school to college, just a little snippet of that initial eligibility. And so that resource that's online, and I put it into the chat, I didn't put the link, but at least I put the name in there, is extremely helpful. So I appreciate that. I'm kind of happy that the book is now is virtual, because it's easy, it's easy to flip through the pages on the computer. Thank you, Becky. I'd like to now introduce Dr. Chad Dorr, Director of Counseling and Sports Psychology for UNLV Athletics, who is a licensed clinical psychologist in Nevada and a certified mental performance coach. Dr. Dorr completed his graduate training at James Madison University, the University of Denver, and UC Davis. He has over 8 years of experience working with high school, college, and professional athletes. And as I said, he just arrived here at UNLV April. So maybe we might even be his first webinar, official one from UNLV. So hopefully you'll have some questions for him later. But Dr. Dorr will now outline the importance of balancing athletics and academics with good mental health. He will also give his perspective and share his experiences and advice as an expert in this field. Dr. Dorr, let me go ahead and start off with you. I'm going to give you a little bit of a scenario. A promising student athlete was very focused on their dreams to play at the college level, but that pandemic kind of killed that drive. While the parent and coach doesn't want to pressure them, to play in college, one might worry they would look back and regret their decision. Do you have any advice in helping them find their motivation, making peace with their decision?
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you take one thing from the time that I'm talking, it would be that the better that you can develop adolescents' ability to self-organize, the better that kids are going to be in the future. And I think that's a really important part of the adolescent to adulthood developmental trajectory. And so that's self-organizing. Self-organization comes from the frontal lobe of your brain in the front area. And for most adolescents, it's not fully cooked yet. And so one of the things that is really important is that you help them with this process. And so with that, one way, a very practical way, if you're looking at a situation like this to help someone self-organize is understand, process, clarify, process, understand, and really ask a lot of open-ended questions to be able to help them understand and learn this self-organization standpoint. So like, here's an example of how I would do this in a therapy session. And again, I'm a professional that's done this for a really long time, but this is something that a coach or a parent or anybody can really do with somebody is start to really ask questions with these adolescents of what's important to you, what do you value, what goals can you think of? If you and one that I really like is if you were flourishing in 5 years, like what would that look like? What would that feel like? Where would you be? I like that better than what's a 5-year plan because that can really freeze people. It's more like how would you want to feel in 5 years? And so what you're starting to do there is get more of these broader aspects. And so some people say like, I value physical activity. I like challenging myself. I like hanging out with my friends. I like learning. And so you start to get some of this data, this information that might be very broad. And then you say, okay, great. So how does college athletics fit into all of this? And does it fit into this? And so one of the things that you're looking at is if someone doesn't necessarily feel like they have that drive right now, why is that? That's the bigger question. And there could be a couple of different things that we can talk about there, but one of them could be that they're having a difficult time connecting the story of college athletics or sport to what they think is important. And if you can reconnect that, a lot of times you can mitigate that burnout part. And so if they start saying, I like the structure part, I like to challenge myself, I like community, camaraderie, all of those things fit into athletics. And so then one of the things that you can say from a wellness perspective is that most environments for college athletics would probably lead to wellness for this individual. And so then you're taking what they're talking about and you're starting to frame it and organize it for them. And the more you're able to do that, usually you can be really helpful. When I do therapy with adolescents, especially late high school individuals, that's a lot of what I do is, ask them what they feel is important and then start to try to point that map. I'm not saying go in this direction, but I'm trying to show them how they can do that on their own. And that's something that you can really do there. A unique aspect about the pandemic that I want to give some education about is what's called behavioral activation theory. And this is pretty much the therapeutic style that I've worked with everybody for the last 2 years. When the pandemic started, I was still working embedded in the University of Nebraska athletic department. And so I saw a lot of that shut down for those student athletes that were grinding every single day, very, very long days that they had been doing for most of their life. And then the world completely shut down. And then as I left there and transitioned into private practice, I was working with a lot of individuals that were in jobs. I was also working with high school individuals. I was working with professional athletes that weren't doing anything. And it was that same story of what was called it's called behavioral deactivation. And so it would be just like from a physical standpoint, if you were lifting weights every single day and really, really working those muscles, you probably wouldn't have as much of that fatigue. But then if you didn't squat for 8 months and then you went back and tried to put like 135 pounds on, you would barely be able to walk. And so one of the things that is really happened for a lot of people is this massive behavioral deactivation. And that can look like, what does it look like to pack a lunch? What's it like to commute into different places? What's it like to pick up verbal and nonverbals? And all of these things can be incredibly exhausting because they got completely shut down. And that can look like killing drive, but it can also look like a massive amount of fatigue that I think a lot of people are feeling as they're getting ramped up right now. And so one of the things that I've been trying to provide a lot of education on is really normalizing this feeling. If you don't feel motivated right now, that doesn't mean that you're broken. That means that you're almost like you're behaviorally deactivated. And that honestly, motivation can be pretty overrated right now. And it's much more for, I think, people as things are opening up about starting to get back into habits that are aligned with their values and goals. And I think a lot of our culture talks so much about feeling motivated, but then we got out of habits. And so it makes it really hard right now. And so part of it is explaining that to individuals and then helping them get into environments where you're just praising them showing up and doing some of the challenges, and people will get back into that ability to do the longer days, and then they will feel that drive and that passion. But a lot of it is just getting everything really kind of kicked up and going right now. And I think a lot of people are feeling a lot of fatigue in this return to work situation. And so it isn't, I think for a lot of people, it's not an aspect of not a lot of drive. It is this aspect of mass behavioral deactivation. One of the other things that I like to talk about with this too is that college athletics isn't for everybody, and that's okay. I think sometimes when I was working with a lot of adolescents that wanted to go play in college and their parents were talking about that, and there was a lot of pressure, I gave a lot of psychoed on what it was like to be an athlete at Nebraska and what that actually entailed, and the realistic aspect that you're probably going to be doing stuff for 12, 13 hours a day, and it's really not for everybody. And that's okay. That doesn't mean that, you're flawed or you're broken. That means that there's other things, and that's perfectly okay. And so there could be a component that they're looking at what it looks like to be a college athlete and it doesn't fit them. And I think that is something that's okay. And then it's, how do you integrate other aspects into your life? How do you integrate exercise and these other things for your mental health and wellness? And so I wanted to give a couple other kind of specific practical tips too for balancing athletics and academic performance that may lead to more mental wellness. There's a lot on adolescents' plates, like a lot. And that goes back to a lot gets put on their plate. And there's also difficulties with the self-organization aspect, which a lot of times can lead to a lot of anxiety and then just shut down because you don't know what to do. And so one of the more practical things that I really like to do is I have someone write out every single thing that you have to do or every single thing that you're invested in. And that can be like sleep, nutrition. I got to go to walk. I got to take a walk. I need to talk with this person. I need to post this thing online, every single thing. And then write it all completely out and then say, okay, great. So which ones for you are really, really important and the ones that you want to care the most about? Is it this class? Is it this assignment? Is it this relationship? Is it this? And what things do you just need to do okay? And then, okay, so it's this and this and this. Great. So give yourself permission to just be okay at these things and put more energy towards the things that really matter. And that's the concept of intentionality, which I think is super important right now. A lot of people post a lot of stuff online where they look like they have it together. And I work with a lot of those people and they don't have it together. And it's really important to be frank and honest with that, because you can't do everything great, even though a lot of adolescents feel like they need to be great at everything. So the more practical you can be about what do you really want to care about and really invest in, and what things do you just need to like be okay with, and be okay being okay with it is super, super huge. And so that's what I do a lot. That's a lot of the stress management working in an athletic department is that for people, is talking about aspects like that, because You can't be great at everything. That's okay. That's part of being human. A practical way and a book resource for this is called The Power of Full Engagement by Jim Lair, who's a very prominent mental performance coach. And that I learned a lot of these things in my master's program at University of Denver. Another thing that I really like to talk about with coaches and parents and student athletes is this idea called the growth equation. And the growth equation is a group of two amazing people that have a podcast and they've written a couple books. So the growth equation podcast is a great recommendation in terms of that balance of mental wellness and high performance. And they just speak in a very clear and cohesive manner, which I really, really like. And they talk about the growth equation being rest plus stress equals growth. And so when you start looking at those things is what do you want to add that's going to help you grow, but also what do you need to subtract? Because you do need to have that rest to be able to grow and maximize. There's times where you need to grind, but also if you're doing that forever, you're just going to get really burnt out as well. So that is a really good framework. Again, if we're talking about teaching adolescents to self-organize, if you can give them frames like that, then a lot of times they can look at their behaviors and their actions and then be able to say, is this aligned with my values or not? One of the other really underrated recovery tools, I mean, I could talk ad nauseum, and I do a lot about like sleep, nutrition, walks, meditation, a lot of those. I think social connection is super, super important. I think a lot of things that are going on right now, there's a loneliness epidemic. There's been a lot of really interesting books written about that. And we are very social people. And I do think sport can be really good at creating those social connections when done properly. And I think that's something that's going to be really important for the internal well-being of people. People do better when they feel connected. We're evolved to be in small groups. And so the more you can generate environments for connection, the better. And I think that's something that we're really trying to do with the UNLV athletic department with what we did last night with the social events and things like that, is to how do you engineer environments to create more social connection? I think those are really huge. So again, just in summary, teach adolescents how to self-organize. If they can start to do that and get better at that in terms of structuring things, you're going to see them be able to manage their anxiety better. Anxiety isn't a problem. It's a problem when it gets overwhelming and then you shut down and don't do anything. So if you can teach that a lot of times, then you're going to be able to help people balance everything in a high performance environment.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Dorr. Very insightful, and I love your perspective. If you have any of those links that you might have to what you talked about, the underrated recovery tools, don't hesitate to put either words or whatever into chat, and then that way our audience can go ahead and pick that up. As we all know, transition from high school to college is a big change, and change is often difficult for many. And there's no question that it at the same time going from interscholastic student athlete, making that transition into the intercollegiate student athlete, there's lots of balance that has to go on to meet these challenges. While I heard several great ideas and concepts and strategies throughout, what I heard from Dr. Lowe, it's one of the best times to be a female student athlete, to make this transition. Look at what we've got in terms of role models that are out there. And I love the term see her, be her. I heard from Mallory. I'm going to kind of meld what she says and then what she had mentioned, another person that she took some words from. She said, your sport is not who you are. It helps you make the results so much better. I heard from Becky. Remember, early education, being proactive, and time management. If they get that as a good foundation, as a basis, that's really going to be useful in life, in life also. And I heard from Dr. Dorr to self-organize. And that right now, maybe those students their brains aren't quite there yet. It's to help them, but it's not to enable them. It's a tool to use, and that they need to understand, process, and clarify. So we threw a lot at you today. Before we go into our question and answer, I do want to thank Young Bach. He's our Director of Information Technology. He's going to help us as we sort of transition. I see there's a question in the Q&A chat. Again, we're more than happy to hear you talk and ask your question, but if you don't quite feel comfortable, we'll manage the Q&A and chats. I also want to thank Nancy Weaver, who is our communication director. Both of those are at the College of Ed. She brought this idea to us, and then we just kind of ran with it to see how we could do this transition. But and I also want to thank my panel right now for taking your time out of the day. But you're not done, because you have to answer some questions, and then I'll come back on. So now let's hear from our audience what questions you might have, and then let's see how we can answer them. So let me go to this Q&A. I see there's one in here from Pastor Ivy. He said, I had to leave. Oh, he had to leave the session for another one on campus, but he wanted to understand why there was no representative of the BIPOC community on the panel. I'll have to look into that. I'm very disappointed to hear a perspective from a white-only panel in the area of sports. The woman perspective was well covered, yet Black, Hispanic, Asian, he makes a good point. So we're going to look into that. And again, this is our first go around, so I will make sure to get back to him. But is there any perspective that anybody might want to add? Because I do know in my classrooms, we have a very diverse population. And I know, and Aunt Nancy, I'll come to you in a second. And I know Mallory and Rebecca serve that is our population. So go ahead, Nancy.
Yeah, it's a really good question, but the reality is one that this is a pervasive problem in college athletics. We don't have good representation of BIPOC people in college athletics in general. It's very white male dominated. Getting women in is one of our first initiatives, but it's also extremely underrepresented from all of the other areas of whether it's race, gender, and even LGBT. And college sport has been one place where the stigma around being a lesbian, being gay is still pervasive. Pastor's point is well taken. If you look at the research from the Tides Institute, you will see what I'm referring to as far as the underrepresentation in college athletics. It's a cultural issue. It's one that college athletic administrators are aware of. Increasingly, we even have diversity, equity, and inclusion officers within athletics. But unfortunately, the representation is not where it should be. Now, that's not to say that we aren't doing better at UNLV. Our athletic director is a Black male. We have better representation across the administration. But his point was well taken. I think it's always something that we have to be mindful of.
I agree. Let's see, we've got a couple more questions here. Albert asked, do you see any trends with incoming freshmen that are coming into a successful team? For example, high expectations, stress, added scheduling. Anybody can answer that question?
Yeah, Albert, I can talk about that one. Coming into a successful team is really interesting. I think one of the aspects that, if we're talking about successful team I guess there's an interesting part of how do you define it. The most successful teams that I've seen in terms of wins and losses and well-being and satisfaction, those teams are really structured. And the environment's really set up for success because there already is a lot of that. Here's what we stand for. Here's what's important. You are important. You are welcome here. And a lot of times it helps people thrive. And so I think that's one that a lot of times it's about the environment that they come into, I think, in terms of that. And I think with the pressure and expectations, a lot of that's framing. I think you hope that there's a staff around, not just coaches, but a staff that frames that, this is where you are. And we just want you to continue to grow. And this is, if you think about going into an environment, it's like having really good soil and good sun that's going to help a flower blossom. And so if there's pressure and expectations, you hope that they put the right fertilizer on that to help that grow and blossom. And I think that's what's been some of the best environments that I've seen as well. So I think it's one of those things where managing pressure and expectations is a lot about how are people going to help that person be able to frame it in a better way. The teams that I've seen that are really successful that struggle with the well-being, it's much more of that cutthroat aspect that isn't necessarily promote mental health and wellness, but it's more of a sink or swim approach. And I think that a lot of those environments aren't occurring as much anymore in college athletics because they're being exposed or people are able to transfer pretty quickly. So I do think that's more of an environmental question, in my opinion, that people can kind of get set up for success with.
And then Albert asks another question. Are there any similarities you see in athletes that are fairly successful with their transition from high school to college? For example, do they have siblings that are in college athletes? Is the location close to home? They go on into college teams with other freshmen. I'll have Becky and then Mallory answer that one.
Yeah, that is a great question. I think a lot of the times you can see an easier transition if you have had like siblings or parents that have gone through the college experience just from that aspect. But here, like, for example, here at UNLV, we have about 15% are first generation student athletes. They don't have that experience from the family to kind of come in and be a resource. But that's where it comes to, like, when you're researching and looking into a school and an atmosphere, what kind of resources are available to you, and the people that are surrounding you that can kind of fill in that semi gap at that moment. I would say the biggest thing is it doesn't matter who you are, where you're coming from, what your family's experiences are. If you come in open and you're a sponge and you're coachable and you're willing to, like I said earlier, ask questions, seek help, you're going to be successful. If you're open and willing to go in that direction, you will find success, and you have people to back you and surround you with that education that you may have not necessarily came in with.
Mallory?
Yeah, I don't know how much I would really add to that. I think Becky's points are well said, and actually really what Dr. Chad pointed out as well, I think kind of stacks onto that as it relates to just, you know, your sort of resiliency muscle, for lack of a better phrase, and those that, you know, use failure as a teacher and are really open to accessing the resources and utilizing the people around them to help them kind of troubleshoot through whatever setbacks there may be. But as it relates to kind of a consistent trend, I would see it more as kind of a mindset and an attitude around how people approach, you know, problems and opportunities more than anything. But Becky, great points.
And then Becky, there's in chat, there's a question that's directed to you from Brendan. He asks, can you speak to students retaking classes in the summer to improve a grade? Does that allow them to replace a core grade to improve their high school core?
That's a great question. And a lot of the times it kind of depends on the situation and the course and the time you're taking it. But you have a little flexibility in that area. What I would actually recommend is that whatever that specific scenario is, to, again, use your resources, have the student use a resource to reach out to the NCAA Eligibility Center and ask the specific questions and give the specific situation. Also, if they already are committed or potentially committed to a school, your student athlete academic services are here to make sure you get that exact information that you need to be successful in your admittance and your final qualifier status. So just it's a fuzzy line in a lot of these areas with academic eligibility and meeting requirements. So it's always to take your specific situations to your resources and get the actual, you know, best answer possible.
So I think that we've answered Albert's question. Hazel, Jen, Josie, Leaf, Nancy, anybody have any questions? And I see that a couple people did have to go. I think there's one more question in our queue. This is for Dr. Chad from Leaf. In your opinion, what is the most effective and sensitive way to address disordered eating behaviors without directly confronting or approaching the student athlete?
Yeah, hey Leaf, that's a really, really good question. One of the really interesting parts about that is there's this mediation when you're addressing stuff like that in a relationship. And so I think one of the more important things with that question first is it starts with having a relationship with that person. And it would be different if it's someone that you have, like, there isn't a trust or a respect or a part of that, and just saying like, hey, I'm concerned, versus saying like, hey, I'm concerned. So I think from a practical standpoint, I like to think about this idea of like rapport tokens. And do you have enough rapport tokens where it feels like that this challenging message is going to be heard in the right way? So that's one thing. The other thing that you can talk about is, say, I feel blank when I see that you are engaging in this type of behavior. And so you're not saying like you have a problem. It's more of I'm affected by your behavior. And so it kind of creates what's called like an empathy hook there. And so I think that that's something that's really important, because anytime that you're confronting someone, whether that it's an issue related to disordered eating or how they might be approaching a relationship, substance abuse, anything like that, it's really important to say like, hey, I feel impacted by what you're doing, as opposed to saying like you're doing something wrong. And so, I think those are the necessarily more of the indirect ways to do it. There's a couple other little like nuances to it, but those are kind of the two that I really think off the top of my head are important. Any type of confrontation can be really tough unless there's that good relationship.
I really want to thank all of you in our audience for taking time out of your day to enter into this important conversation. Again, thanks to my co-lead, Dr. Lowe, and our panelists for sharing your expertise. I want to thank your audience for the engaging questions and your attention, and I hope this Scholarship in Practice webinar has been productive for you. Good evening, and we're always here. You can find us on campus. Just type in our names and you'll find our email if you ever have any questions. So thank you.